Hello everyone, my name is Jo Outred. I'm part of the marketing team at Oxford Languages. We're delighted to be here today with Dr. Seth Mehl of Sheffield University and the Linguistic DNA Project. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Seth, who can introduce himself properly and tell you about his project.
Okay, good morning. This is Seth Mehl. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks also to the Oxford English Dictionary and to Simone and Joe for arranging this. I'm a Digital Humanities Fellow, member of research staff at the University of Sheffield. I work really closely with the Digital Humanities Institute Sheffield, which is a major research center for digital humanities and more for corpus linguistics as well. And I'm going to talk today about the Linguistic DNA Project, which is a project that I've been working on since 2015. And the work that we've been doing with the Oxford English Dictionary over the past year or so. So I'll start by outlining the Linguistic DNA Project and its aims, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about lexical co-occurrence, what exactly it means and how we use it. I'll present the Linguistic DNA tool, which is a computational tool that we've been using to map and model meanings in early modern English in particular, but also beyond early modern English, and what we're calling linguistic concept modeling. I'll give you some examples of the ways that we've mapped words and the concepts associated with them, and also texts and the concepts associated with them, including a bit of a discussion of how the Oxford English Dictionary is using this tool to map words. I'll tell you about the next steps for the project, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So the Linguistic DNA Project started in 2015, and its aims were to analyze conceptual content in early modern English texts. So we knew that we were interested in concepts. We knew that we were interested in semantics and pragmatics in early modern English texts. We knew that we were interested in discourse and topic as well. And we wanted to use computational methods and to design a new computational tool alongside manual linguistic analysis of texts in order to analyze the conceptual content. So we knew that we wanted to process big data, but also that we wanted to do close reading as linguists. So in order to get at conceptual content and meaning, we wanted to calculate lexical co-occurrence. And we wanted to do that in a bottom-up, relatively inductive way by looking at lexical co-occurrence, which I'll talk more about, looking at lexical co-occurrence for all words in all texts. Rather than seeding the process with words that we knew in advance would be interesting. So that means investigating every word in every text. Part of the reason for that is that this grew out of an idea for a project to look at social and cultural keywords in early modern English. And as those ideas sort of developed, we realized that we didn't want to go in as 21st century researchers with our ideas of those words that would be the social and cultural keywords in early modern English. We wanted to see if we could do this in a data-driven way. So that's how we arrived at these aims back in 2015. The thing that made all of this possible was the availability of a significant bit of text data from 2015. The story with the text data starts with early English books online, known as EBO. EBO was completed in 1998 with contributions from over 400 libraries around the world and over 120,000 texts. The texts are printed texts that were printed generally in England and British Isles between 1473 and 1700. You'll notice that 1473 is the exception to being printed in the British Isles, because of course printing was introduced by Caxton in the British Isles in 1476. So we just have a couple of texts printed in English on the continent before 1476. And these are digitally scanned texts. Some of these are texts that were originally microfilm, and the microfilm was then scanned, but it was all then made available online. So this was a revolutionary thing. But of course, there was a bit of a catch. As scanned texts and scanned microfilm, there's a question of quality, and there's also a question of searchability and of access. So the next step in this, which was completed in 2015, was the text creation partnership edition of Early English Books Online, which we call EBO TCP. It includes over 60,000 texts, so it's just about half of EBO. Again, it's the same dates. It's early modern English print. And this collection was hand-keyed by professional transcribers. So that means that individuals sat down with each scanned digital image from EBO, up to 60,000 texts, and hand-typed each text letter by letter, so that we have a transcription. And that, of course, is text data, which we can then search. Those themselves are not experts in early modern English. They may not know any English at all, but they are professionals who work all day, every day, transcribing texts from many different languages, letter by letter. So they're quite good at that. You can imagine, we can talk further about, and maybe we can talk about in the Q&A, some of the issues that can arise from that. But in general, this is again, a revolutionary collection. We then, once we have text files, are able to interact with those text files from early modern English texts with a process of spelling regularization. That means, of course, that because words could be spelled in a variety of different ways in the 16th and 17th centuries, there isn't a great deal of spelling standardization at the time. We've got a computer process to regularize texts and to lemmatize them such that we can search for lemmas across all inflectional forms, and also part of speech tagging so that we can search, for example, for the word white as a noun or white as an adjective. All of that's done by Morphadorner, which is a software package that was developed at Northwestern University specifically for early modern English, and that's what sits behind the existing online interfaces for EBO TCP. Okay, so once we have tens of thousands of early modern English texts as text files, and we can start searching for words, and we can start searching not only for words, but for lemmas, and we can search by part of speech and so on, then we can start calculating lexical co-occurrence. So the phenomenon of which words are co-occurring with which other words in these texts. So what does co-occurrence data tell us? John Firth is famous for having said that a word is known by the company it keeps. This was one of the early ideas in 20th century corpus linguistics. The principle here is that when one word co-occurs with another, word A can tell us something about word B. So quite literally and technically, we're asking, when writers use word A, what other words are used nearby? So there is, of course, an interpretive step from co-occurrence to meaning. We have this idea that when words co-occur, they tell us something about each other's meaning, but there are lots of different ways that that can happen, and that's part of the reason that for this project, we insist on combining a computational tool for calculating lexical co-occurrence with close reading performed by linguists looking closely at texts. So there are lots of different ways that this can happen. If two words co-occur, it might be to reinforce meaning. So the word marmalade will co-occur frequently with the word orange. That's because marmalade tends to be orange. It's a sort of a redundancy. People expect marmalade to be orange, but we still often say orange marmalade. It can be to specify meaning. So in this case, it isn't just to reinforce an existing meaning. If we're talking about a car, we could be talking about any number of different cars, but if the word car co-occurs with foreign, then we're specifying the meaning of the word car. It can also be to defease a meaning. So in this case, there's research on this particular example, but people still expect a nurse to be female. So when I talk about my friend who's a nurse, who's a man, I sometimes have to clarify with, depending on the listener, and say, oh yeah, he's a male nurse. So if you see the difference between male nurse and orange marmalade, there's something actually very different happening in these two examples. Now, the computer can't tell that something different is happening. Computational linguists are working on the possibility of computers being able to tell the difference between those two things. But for now, we need linguists and readers to look closely at these types of examples to see the difference between them. The computer can tell us what's co-occurring, but not the depth of the meaning. It can also relate to topic or real-world context or discourse. So we can see that when democracy co-occurs with the word Athens, not necessarily adjacent to each other, but maybe in the same sentence or even in the same paragraph, we might be looking at a particular topic or a context or a discourse about democracy or a form of government in ancient Greece. When democracy co-occurs with fascism, again, in a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph, this is something related to topic or context or discourse, quite possibly about the Second World War and democracy and fascism in Europe. And if we see democracy co-occurring with media, again, a different topic or context or discourse, quite possibly the impact of social media on contemporary democracy today. That's just from lexical co-occurrence pairs. But again, the sort of meaning that we're seeing there is the sort of thing that a computer can point us towards, but we then have to analyze and interpret. If we look at the theoretical background to lexical co-occurrence, the first idea, which is the oldest idea here, it goes back to ancient Greece, and the concepts of these particular concepts appear from 16th century English. We have the idea of denotation and connotation. Denotation is the idea of a constant or central or primary meaning of a word, regardless of any of its context or regardless of further specification or defeasing and so on. Connotation can be a secondary meaning beyond a word's primary meaning, and we might think of that as these sort of further specified or defeased meanings that are informed a bit more by context and by the words around it. Getting a bit more specific, there's a good amount of work on meaning and ideas of co-occurrence going back to the 19th century philological tradition in language study. In 1881, Hermann Paul published The Principles of the History of Language. And he argued from the perspective of semantics and word meaning that words and phrases have a usual meaning and an occasional meaning. This relates to denotation and connotation, but it isn't quite the same thing. When Paul talks about, he's talking about a meaning that is conveyed in any and all contexts by a particular word. When he talks about occasional meaning, he's talking about meaning that is added via context. That can include lexical co-occurrence. So again, if we go back to the idea that a car has a particular meaning that, the word car has a meaning that is conveyed in any and all contexts. And as soon as we start to say a foreign car or a domestic car or an electric car or a petrol car and so on, then we are adding meaning. Even further, we could say a toy car or a wooden car and so on, and we'd be coming up with an occasional meaning for these sorts of cars. Interestingly, and I put a side note here as well, because I think this is important, Paul talks about the idea that occasional meaning can be influenced by speaker intention and hearer reception. And these are ideas that become really important in pragmatics in the 20th century, many years later. And in some sense, these ideas are sort of reinvented later on. Occasional meanings, Paul says, can also be gradually conventionalized to transform into usual meanings. So if we look at the history of the word marmalade, its oldest meaning generally defaulted to being a fruit preserve that was made from quince. It then broadens, and we come to see that marmalade can be made with any sort of fruit, and so there will be specifying word in front of marmalade in historical English to specify which sort of fruit it's made from. We then eventually reach this point where orange marmalade becomes the norm, and eventually now if we say marmalade, most people's expectation will be that it's made with oranges, and if it's made with something else, then we would need to defease that meaning with another word. So again, the meanings represented by lexical co-occurrence can be quite complex, and people have been talking about them for well over 100 years. Darmstaedter, not very long after, in The Life of Words, argues that a word's immediate lexical context influences and defines its meaning. And he talks about this really interesting semantic process that he calls contagion, which is that co-occurrences with words can, by convention, affect the word's core meaning. Again, marmalade is a reasonable example of that. In the 20th century, linguists, and in this case, an anthropologist, in the case of Malinowski, continue to talk about the way that context is important in understanding meaning. Malinowski steps beyond lexical co-occurrence to say that because language is a tool that we use in contexts, language must be investigated in context in order to understand the meaning of language. Now, for Malinowski, the context of the situation includes the social, cultural, and material contexts, and that becomes really important for the Linguistic DNA Project as we investigate not just the words that co-occur together, but their social, cultural, and material contexts beyond the text. Of course, by the mid-20th century, we have the birth of pragmatics formally, and we have Austin with How to Do Things with Words, arguing that the meanings of most utterances emerge from their contexts. And when we look at pragmatics, today we look at a broad range of contexts from the co-occurring words with a given word or with a given utterance up through the social and cultural and material and political and economic contexts, and everything in between. With early corpus linguistics, we come back to Firth with the idea that a word shall be known by the company it keeps, and we have this excellent example of John Sinclair leading the Co-Build Dictionary Project, which was the first dictionary that was designed around corpus data. And with the Co-Build Dictionary, we see that the meanings of words and phrases are defined in relation to their actual use in corpora, but also in relation to their co-occurrences in corpora. So if you look at any given contemporary English corpus, you'll see that a word like make occurs with a high frequency with words like decision and contribution and use. So in the Co-Build Dictionary, the very first meaning listed for the word make is its light verb meaning, which is examples like make a decision, make a contribution, and make use. Whereas if you look at a lot of other dictionaries, you'll see, and for various reasons, dictionaries and lexicographers make these decisions in informed ways, but a lot of other dictionaries will list a concrete meaning of the word make first, making furniture or making clothing, that sort of thing. Although that isn't at all the most common meaning, and those direct objects won't be the most common co-occurrences for the verb make. By the time we get into cognitive linguistics in the late 20th century, we have the argument that meaning includes both constant and contingent meaning. And again, this is evocative of Hermann Paul going back to 1881. The constant meaning is the meaning that exists within the word. The idea is that it might exist even in any and all contexts, although that's debated. And the contingent meaning is the meaning that comes from context. And cognitive linguistics argues that actually there is no non-arbitrary division between those. We consider all of that meaning in language. Okay, which brings us to the linguistic DNA approach. We started with these theoretical principles about lexical co-occurrence, and we started with the goals that I outlined at the beginning. And we said that we were interested in looking at lexical co-occurrence data in early modern English print. We do insist that data on co-occurring words doesn't represent final answers. As I said, computers are really good at counting up which words co-occur together. They're not very good at understanding meaning. So co-occurrence data needs to be interpreted in terms of semantics and pragmatics, sociolinguistics, meaning and context by linguists, historians, and philologists, among others. And the outputs from our computational analysis of lexical co-occurrence have to be checked against our close manual reading of texts as linguists. It's also essential to point out that processes for analyzing text data are not simply natural laws. It isn't that there is just sort of one right process for doing this. There are lots of different viable processes to choose from. That's why we have methodology and we ask methodological questions. There are many ways of implementing any given method, and part of the point of asking methodological questions is, of course, to compare methods, to ask what we can know from any given method, and then to choose the method that's appropriate for giving us the information or for allowing us to know the things that we want to know. So with that in mind, we started by experimenting with Co-Occurrence Windows. We knew that we wanted to analyze every word in every text in EBO TCP from early modern English, and we started looking at possible co-occurrence windows. So if we wanted to come up with a model of a word like diversity, which I'll show you in a bit, we knew that we could look at the words that co-occur with the word diversity across an entire text that contains the word diversity. That's the sort of model that's generally used with topic modeling approaches. We end up with a list of words or a list of co-occurrences that represents a book or an article. We could then move down to the level of the paragraph, certainly in contemporary English, although paragraphs aren't exactly a salient thing in early modern English. If we're interested in the words that co-occur with the word diversity within a paragraph, it might give us a sense of the discourse or the topic or the meaning of the word diversity within that given paragraph. We have precedents for looking 10 words to either side of the node word, so 10 words to the left and 10 words to the right of diversity, of the word diversity. We can ask about all of the co-occurrences. Round about the turn of the millennium, there were psycholinguistic arguments saying that 10 words to the left or to the right was about the number of words that we would hold in our mind at a time. That eventually became revised, and it's generally agreed that maybe 5 words is a more psycholinguistically real window for the number of words that a reader holds actively in their mind at a time. So that there is then this precedent of 5 words to either side of a node word. And then finally, you have examples of things like 2 words to the left of a node word. There's some excellent work at Leuven around the specific co-occurrence windows that are most useful for describing particular types of meaning of particular word classes or particular semantic fields. So this is really, really precise work that has come up with conclusions along the lines of how many words to the left and to the right should you analyze if you're looking for synonyms of a verb, for example. That's really interesting work that hasn't tended to be picked up by computational linguistics more broadly. For the Linguistic DNA project, after quite a bit of experimentation, we decided that we were interested in analyzing non-adjacent co-occurrences across a span of about 100 words. So that's 50 words to either side of a node, like the word diversity. So we count up all of the co-occurrences, 50 words to the left, for example, of the word diversity, and all of the co-occurrences, 50 words to the right. This is something that's larger than a sentence, smaller than an entire text. It's something like a paragraph, although as I say, we don't exactly have paragraphs in early modern English, but it's this kind of topical discursive span that was the sort of meaning that we were after. That is to say, we knew that we weren't interested, for example, in identifying synonyms. We knew that we were much more interested in this idea of meaning and discourse, semantics and pragmatics more broadly in early modern English texts. We decided that we were interested in co-occurring content words, not grammatical words like of, and the. In our case, this means nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Adverbs would be an interesting one to add, but one of the peculiarities of our part of speech tagging system is that our adverb category ends up including a whole bunch of things in addition to adverbs, and it isn't terribly useful for that reason. So for the moment, at least, it's nouns, verbs, and adjectives as content words. We also rank strength of co-occurrence. So we look at the co-occurring words that seem to have a stronger bond. And because we use mutual information scores, this also measures something like unusualness. I won't go much further into those statistics right now, but if anyone is interested, please do bring it up in the Q&A. That's fine. I'm happy to talk about it further. Along the line, we've conducted other experiments. We've conducted smaller and larger windows of analysis. So for example, we've looked 100 tokens to the left and to the right of a node word, which is an interesting experiment that not many people look at. We've also gone smaller, down to 30 windows to the left and right, 30 tokens to the left and right, 10 words to the left and right, and also 5. One of the interesting things that we see there is that we see different sorts of co-occurrences from within the same lexical fields. Now, this isn't central to our research, but this is a sort of methodological question that's interesting, I think, to pursue a bit further. If you look at a word like soldier in early modern English, you can see, for example, that co-occurrences of 10 words to the left or right, you see words like you see words like centurion, say 10 words to the left and right, military words that you would expect to co-occur strongly with the word soldier. And as you expand the window, you start to see different military words occurring in each of those levels of windows. So there's something going on there discursively, which is fascinating. That's another experiment. It's going to be another project for Linguistic DNA to look at later on. We've also experimented with frequency thresholds, for example, looking only at co-occurrences of high frequency or medium frequency or low frequency words. At the moment, we're analyzing any words that occur more than twice in all of Evo TCP, just so that we have enough data to make generalizations, but again, analyzing as much as we can. Here's an example of what a co-occurrence window looks like, 50 words to the left and 50 words to the right of a given word. If we're analyzing co-occurrences for the word valor, which you'll see in bold here and italics, we have a span of 50 tokens to the left and 50 tokens to the right, and you'll see that valor co-occurs with Saxons, valor co-occurs with empire, valor co-occurs with glory, and you can count through these. And of course, there are lots of other words here that might be intuitively, maybe, less obvious than valor and glory, valor and firm, valor and continual, and so on. So what our process does is counts up all of these co-occurrences across each of these windows, across over 1 billion words of tens of thousands of early modern English text. We look at co-occurrence pairs. So coming back to the word diversity, we know that early modern English writers use diversity in each of these pairs, which are both highly frequent and highly internally cohesive. According to the statistical measures, we see diversity and opinion, which often occur quite close together. We see diversity of opinion, diversity and nature, diversity and body, diversity in place, and so on. Now, one of the things that has been innovative about the Linguistic DNA Project is that we knew, because we're interested in mapping these kind of discursive meanings, that pairs weren't going to be adequate for us. We also knew that when we see word lists from processes like topic modeling, or sometimes from different distributional semantic methods, we might see lists like diversity, opinion, body, and so on. But what those processes don't do is identify spans of text where all of the words in the list actually co-occur. So we were interested in being able to say, what are the sets of 3 words or even 4 words eventually, and maybe onward eventually, that actually co-occur in these discursive spans of 100 texts. So this was new. And of course, building from pairs to trios, the size of the data increases exponentially. And that's one of the prohibiting factors for a lot of projects in doing this type of work. But we've harnessed high performance computing in order to look at trios for every content word in EBO TCP. And so we can say, for example, that the high frequency trios that are also highly internally cohesive around diversity are diversity, opinion, religion, diversity, spirit, gift, and diversity, spirit, operation. Depending on how we set our statistical thresholds, we can come up with much longer lists. And of course, our actual data includes billions of trios, so far more trios around the word diversity than just these 3, but these are 3 of the strongest ones. And this is, of course, much richer data, and I think pretty interesting data about the word diversity. So instead of just understanding that we have diversity of opinion that's discussed at length in EBO TCP, we know now not just that it's diversity and opinion, but actually diversity, opinion, and religion form a trio. So this is more data than we saw with our pairs. Again, diversity and spirit was a strong pair, but in our pair list, we didn't see the words gift and operation as strong pairs. So diversity, spirit, gift, there's something going on there with this kind of conceptual or discursive content around those 3 words over and over and over again in early modern English. So as I said there, when I brought up topic modeling and other distributional semantic methods, one of the other important innovations of this project is that we have insisted upon having a transparent link to the texts where these trios occur. Again, our principle here is that computers are really, really good at counting billions of words, but they're not good at understanding meaning. So we need to go from the computational outputs to the texts themselves in order to do close analysis. So once we have a trio in mind, we can look through to a particular example. And I'm going to present some short examples first, but then I'm going to present a longer one in a moment. So with diversity, opinion, religion, our process allows us then to look through directly to examples of where this occurs. An act for abolishing of diversity of opinion in certain articles concerning Christian religion. We can start to look at the history of the word diversity and the idea that diversity entails conflict, and diversity of opinion in particular about religion suggests some sort of instability. And these are the sorts of things that we can analyze with not just then co-occurring lexical information, but also information about history and society and culture. With diversity, spirit, and gift, we have an example like this. By his Son, whom whole he gave us, he taught us the secrets of God. By his Spirit, he enriched our souls with diverse gifts. Again, this gives us not just an idea about the semantics of diversity, but an idea about a concept or a discourse that occurs across spans of text over and over and over again in early modern English. Not every instance of a given trio presents exactly the same sort of discourse. So we have this one then. There are diversities of gifts, but the same spirit, and there are diversities of administrations, but the same Lord, and there are diversities of operations, but God is the same. And one of the interesting things then is not just that we can look at all of the trios or all of the strong trios around the word diversity, but that we can in fact look at all of the different examples of a particular trio like diversity, spirit, gift, and see the ways that meaning is negotiated there. I'm going to come back to this idea because this is one that we're digging into much more recently. The next step, which we've just started to experiment with, is co-occurrence quads. So building from trios into sets of 4 words. Again, this gives us even richer co-occurrence information, even richer discursive information. So I'm just going to give a few examples just to say that these are things that we're starting to explore much further now. So early modern English writers use the word race in the following strong quads: race, great, heavenly, thunderer; race, Ptolemy, reign, year; race, cross, finisher, set. You see with the third one there that you clearly have an example of the polysemy of the word race, where you can run a race, as opposed to the idea that a race is family or kinship ties in early modern English. It's another quick example, and I think this is one that brings in lots of questions about society and culture. Early modern English writers use the word white extremely frequently, and again with this kind of internal cohesiveness. According to the statistics, white, king, pawn, queen, which is clearly about chess. We have lots of discussions of chess. And also, for example, white, Brandenburg, line, and red. And I've only given 2 examples here because this shows us actually, and the rest of the data starts to show us this as well, that the word white is used a great deal in conversations about chess and a great deal in conversations about armies and battles and military history. And we know from lots of recent research in critical race studies that the idea of using white to identify a category of human beings, which is much more established by the end of the 18th century with the sort of rise of the pseudoscience of race. The 17th century is where we start to see the emergence of the word white used to refer to a category of human beings in relation to social and cultural power and empire and so on. And so we're interested in using our quad data to pick apart where that first emerges and how it emerges and what the characteristics of that phenomenon are. So again, this is just the beginning of this research for us, but this is some of the possibilities that the quads can offer. So we've been making this data available to the Oxford English Dictionary. We've developed a specific interface for lexicographical purposes, which is used in-house with the OED for 2 specific purposes to start with. The first is to efficiently identify example sentences for the dictionary from big text data. So if a lexicographer is interested in writing an entry on the word diversity, what a typical lexicographer might do for 16th and 17th century historical examples is to go into EBO TCP and to search all of the thousands of examples of the word diversity and to search through for the appropriate example sentence for a given meaning. And of course, by searching instead for trios around the word diversity, you can immediately narrow down your examples to much more specific types of meaning and much more efficiently find an example sentence. So the interface that we're working with the OED now, a lexicographer can type in the word diversity and see a list of the strongest trios around the word diversity, and then click on a trio to see all of the example sentences that contain that trio. So this should help the efficiency with this lexicographical practice, and the OED is experimenting with it now. The other thing is revising the order of word definitions and even the way that the word senses and subsenses are divided up. So the word diversity, for example, in the OED today begins with 2 senses: the condition or quality of being different or varied, and an instance of this condition or quality. What we're interested in seeing, and again, what the lexicographers are experimenting with right now, is whether there will be examples where the trio data itself can actually suggest to them that maybe there's a different sense of a word that should be listed first, either because it's stronger or more common, or perhaps that subsenses could be divided differently based on sets of trios that seem to be particularly strong around a particular subsense, and so on. So that experiment is ongoing, and we'll see how it can impact lexicographical practice. The other thing that we can do with trio and quad data is to model texts or entire groups of texts. So we can look, for example, at the top trios in a particular type of text, or even in all of EBO TCP. So I've shown here the top trios, again, the strongest trios in sermons and related texts from EBO TCP from the 16th and 17th century. So we see trios like life, soul, body, world, heaven, earth, power, earth, heaven, spirit, soul, body, sin, soul, body. One of the things that you see here is that there are repeating pairs that are extremely common, and that they have different third items attached. And in a way, you might look at this and say, well, actually, these must be some of the most common terms in early modern English. There's an awful lot of talk about life, souls, and bodies, whether it's medicine or religion or whatever in early modern English. But we have the interesting phenomenon then that if we compare that to science texts from EBO TCP, we see a very different list: nature, body part, water, body part, etc. So we can model these in interesting ways. And again, I think maybe one of the most valuable parts of this trio or quad data are that we can then go and look at the specific examples where these trios and quads occur. You will also see that in the science texts, this pair, body part, occurs in all of the strongest trios. Now, that I think suggests to us something about the nature of science discourse, which is a bit different from the sermon discourse that we saw in the previous slide. There were pairs that recurred in the sermon's discourse, but there wasn't one pair that seemed to be so central. What we can say here is, in these early modern science texts, there's an awful lot of discussion about body. Remember, body is a polysemous word, so it doesn't necessarily mean the human body or the animal body. We talk about astronomical bodies and so on. And part, again, which is a highly polysemous word. I'm going to come back to that question of these highly polysemous words as well. Again, with the transparent links to text, we have here a longer example, mind, body, and soul from sermons. This is a great one because it allows us to ask a lot of questions about discourse and semantics and pragmatics. This is William Sherlock from 1689, co-occurrences of the words mind, body, and soul. He writes, "Are we fond of bodily pleasures? Are we ready to purchase them at any rate? And if we be men, why should we despise the pleasures of the mind? If we have souls, why should we not reap the benefit and the pleasures of them? Do you think there are no pleasures proper to the soul? Have we souls that are good for nothing, of no use to us, but only to relish the pleasures of the body?" And so on. Some of the questions that we could ask about this mind, body, soul trio then, and I'll pause there again to say, when you see the trio in the list of trios and the outputs here, mind, body, soul, and maybe when you even look at the first examples, the richness of this doesn't necessarily come through, but this is a great example of how digging into this text data really brings out the richness that we can analyze as human beings and as linguists interacting with this computational data. So there are semantic questions. Are mind and soul interchangeable? Are they near synonyms? It seems that there are differences, but there are similarities. We could ask whether body is an antonym, is the opposite of both of them. We could ask, digging further into the text, whether wisdom and knowledge are near synonyms, whether they're categories of pleasure in opposition to other pleasures. We can ask pragmatic questions about rhetorical strategies around the pleasures of the body, mind, and soul. We could look at the disambiguation of pleasure and the way that the words body and soul, when used together here, inform the meaning of this fourth word, pleasure. And in fact, once we calculate quads for more data, we might very well see mind, body, soul, pleasure as a strong quad in early modern English discourse. And then, of course, we can, as I've already shown, expand into these other words into the discourse: pleasure, knowledge, wisdom, truth, and what it is that they mean alongside these. Another question that we're starting to ask here is that with words like mind, body, and soul, and as I pointed out with the words body and part, some of the strongest trios and quads that we see in early modern English data, but actually in other data as well as we start to analyze contemporary texts, the strongest quads and trios tend to include high frequency words that are also highly vague and highly polysemous. Now that might be fairly straightforward. Mind, body, and soul are all high frequency. They have a lot of different meanings and they have a lot of vagueness that can be specified. So these are powerful indications of a historical concept. There is something really important about mind, body, and soul being used together in early modern English, but they're also really, really variable, and they're really contingent, and they depend on context for their interpretation. So they're volatile in a way. One of the questions that we're starting to ask, which relates to discourse analysis and to pragmatics and to semantics, as well as to these particular texts and their context, is whether it's this volatility and it's whether this conflict and competition between the different meanings of this word, each of these words in the trio and the quad, and the way that they affect each other in these spans. Again, this is like the contagion that Darmstaedter talks about, the way that words in relation to each other really affect each other's meanings. Then the actual active work required for interpretation that makes each of these trios and quads and their concepts so essential to early modern discourse, but actually to any discourse. This is the sort of question that we couldn't really ask until we had started to analyze trios and quads in this way, using this new processor that we built. You can explore a public interface for this processor. If you go to linguisticdna.org, which is our project website, you can also find out more about the project. On that homepage, on the right-hand side, there is a link to the online interface for our trio data. It's this second link here as well. It's dhi.ac.uk/ldna. That's the actual online interface for the trio data. That's hosted by the DHI, which is the Digital Humanities Institute at the University of Sheffield, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is a partner in this project and has really done the hard work of the computational processing for this. Okay, so as a corpus linguist, I'm just going to say a few more things here, and then we'll get to the Q&A. As a corpus linguist, I want to offer just a word of caution about what it is that we've done here in relation to corpus linguistic methods and what sorts of conclusions we can draw. This relates to the notion of what a corpus is. So there are broader and narrower definitions of a corpus, but my preferred definition is that a corpus is a collection of language data in use, and that it's systematically sampled to represent a population of language users. So there are lots of different examples of what something like that might look like. It could be hundreds of hours of casual conversation between teenagers in Singapore in 2019. And we could carefully sample that so that we were sure that it represented that population. It could be, for example, UK tabloid newspaper articles about immigration before and after the financial crash. Again, we have a clearly defined population, and we can do careful sampling of that population to make sure that the sample represents that population. And the reason that a corpus is, I think, necessarily a sample that represents a population is that it allows us to study the language in use via the sample in order to draw conclusions about the population, and that can include using inferential statistics. EBO-TCP, under that definition, is not a corpus. It is definitely not sampled systematically. There is no clearly defined population underneath it. It contains early modern English print, but it certainly isn't designed to sample and represent early modern English print. Now, that's because it's an arbitrary sample. It's a sample of convenience. It isn't really designed to represent anything. First and foremost, it contains texts that have survived, and that's arbitrary. What does and doesn't survive isn't within any of our control, and it depends on lots of different variables. It's texts that were available for scanning and transcription. Again, that's arbitrary. And it also is texts that were of interest to the scholars who were involved with EBO-TCP along the way. So a particular librarian, a particular scholar might have said, well, it's really important to me that we transcribe this text. And sometimes, going back to the very beginning when the microfilm was generated, scholars would say, well, I really want to make sure that we have microfilm of this text, so we're going to make sure that we have microfilm of this text and everything else in the same box. So again, this is entirely arbitrary. This is not any kind of sampling procedure. What that means for us is that as we look at this trio data and this quad data, we can say an awful lot about these discourses that we're looking at, but we have to be careful not to draw conclusions about all of early modern English, or even all of early modern written English, or even all of early modern English print. We have central discourses like canonical dramas, sermons, and histories. We also have lots and lots of peripheral material like one-off advertisements. We have dedications from publishers. We have persuasive pamphlets that might have survived that weren't published in large numbers. We have popular songs and unpopular songs. There are recipes, there are indices, all of these sorts of things that are in EBO TCP. So there is no sort of coherent unity that represents early modern English. We can see them as kind of genealogical fragments. So although we can't draw conclusions about all of early modern English from EBO TCP or from our trio or text data, trio or quad data, or the texts that contain the trios and quads, we can still describe a whole lot of interesting things that we can see and that the computational information can point us towards. And I think, and we've talked about this a lot in the project, in a way we hope, that we might be able to challenge some established perspectives and maybe even challenge some traditional dictionary entries by finding some meanings and some discourses that might never have been intuited by any given human reader of early modern English, and that might never have been observable without this trio and quad system that links directly to texts. What's next? Well, we have this ongoing collaboration with the Oxford English Dictionary and the lexicographers, the team there. We are currently also applying it to modeling quad data for the BBC's radio news scripts. These are scripts of radio news going back to the mid-20th century. We're interested in using the trio and quad data again as a kind of richer way into the BBC's radio news scripts. That is also a huge amount of text data. And we're interested in this idea that maybe, again, if you're interested in the word democracy in 20th century BBC radio news, rather than just searching for the word democracy, you might search for the word democracy and come back with examples like democracy, fascism, war, versus democracy, history, Athens, and then be able to go into the specific sorts of concepts that you're interested in. As I gave you an example of earlier, we're interested in studying the meanings of white in early modern English, again, in relation to critical whiteness studies today and the development of, the development towards the pseudoscience of race in the next century. And as I said, we're also interested in examining the nature of this volatility of concepts, the way that these really high frequency, really vague, really polysemous words can interact with each other, and the way that a trio like body, mind, spirit over 200 years can represent a changing concept even within a trio that stays consistent over that time. Thanks very much. So I'm happy to take questions now.
Hi, Seth. Thank you very much for that. It was super interesting, and we've actually had quite a few questions. So I'll just fire them off to you. One of our attendees has asked, does the optimal length of the co-occurrence window for your purposes vary over time? Thinking about how 18th century writers tend to use really long sentences.
Oh goodness, that's a fantastic question. That's exactly the right sort of question. I don't have an answer, but that is exactly the sort of thing that we that's exactly the sort of thing that all of us should be thinking about. It's a great corpus linguistic methodology question. It's something that I would like to experiment with, and it seems entirely plausible that it could vary. Yes. One of the difficulties in asking that question and in answering it is, of course, in how you assess what's optimal. So as I gave with the example of some of Chris Halen's work at Leuven, at KU Leuven in Belgium, they have found that if they're looking, for example, for synonyms of verbs in contemporary Dutch, and they've even looked at things like synonyms of semantically narrow or semantically broad verbs in contemporary Dutch, then they can look at the different types of co-occurrence windows to the left and the right and identify what's most optimal. For us, because there isn't such a simple test as to is this a synonym or not, and because we know that we're interested in these slightly more, well, significantly more vague discourses and kind of semantic and pragmatic and topical and discursive content, it's harder to assess. It doesn't mean we can't do it, but it is harder to assess, and that's what we found, as I say, when we jump from a window of 10 to 30 to 50 to 100, and as we see that there are different types of co-occurrences within the same semantic field and so on. In some ways, we've settled on 50 as a kind of a theoretical foundation as much as a foundation in kind of assessing the practical outputs. But in any case, it's a fantastic question. It's one that I think we should be looking into. Yeah, but I don't have an answer for you.
No worries. Thank you very much. That's still a good answer. Another person has asked, is there a particular reason for choosing the word trio rather than triplet?
Yeah, we had a good long conversation about this at the beginning of the project, and at some point we were debating what the Latinate and the Greek derived forms would be and should be. I don't think there's probably a good reason. I think at some point we were probably saying trio and triplet, and it happened by convention among the team of the 10 of us over time. So the real question is when we, well, maybe another question is when we build from trios to quads and then to sets of 5, which I think we will be doing maybe over the next year. What do we call the sets of 5? But we'll find out.
Okay, great. There is another question asking, how reliable is the method of identifying the trios? Is it possible for a trio to emerge as significant even when it only occurs, even if that's multiple times in a single text? Or does the method indicate a stronger effect if the co-occurrences are spread out across different texts or writers?
Yeah. Good question. So we've had a few different versions of the interface right now for interacting with these billions of trios, and the current version does in fact tell us how many texts, and in fact we can graph, at least internally among the team, we can graph the distribution of those texts over time, sort of decade by decade across the 16th and 17th century. It does matter, of course. What can potentially happen is that, well, for example, with the word white, the question, as you see the quad that is something like white bishop king queen or white bishop queen black or whatever, is it that there are 2 or 3 really, really big volumes of chess analysis books in the 16th and 17th centuries that are totally throwing the data? And so that's conceivable. And right now our process is that we let those through and then we go immediately to looking at the distribution of text over time, and then we can kind of filter through these things manually. It could be automated eventually, and it might be that we will automate that eventually. The other thing that can happen that is interesting, that's important in relation to EBO TCP, is that we do have multiple versions of individual texts, things that were reprinted. And the problem with that also is that it's not just straightforward that something is, of course, in early modern print, it's not just that something is reprinted exactly. That can happen, but things can be reprinted in part and attached to something else, or they can be reprinted with an entirely new introduction, or they can be reprinted with revisions and so on. And so there are kind of varying degrees of repeated texts. So that's there as well, and that can also influence the data. But yeah, it's absolutely important. It's an important question. It's not automated for us right now, but we do address it and deal with it.
Great, thank you very much for answering that one. Another attendee has asked, how does this compare to something like Google Ngrams?
Yeah, good question. So Google Ngrams, oh goodness, I don't know if I remember off the top of my head all the calculations behind Google Ngrams. The most important thing probably in my mind is that Google Ngrams doesn't offer you co-occurrence trios. I don't know how well I can answer this not having used Google Ngrams in a while. But as I understand it, Google Ngrams can map frequencies of words or strings or pairs over time in Google Books. As I say, I don't think it will do trios. And I'm not sure whether it measures a strength of co-occurrence statistic. And that matters as well. So our strength of co-occurrence statistic is based on a particular sort of statistical baseline so that we can try to ask things like, well, given all of the changes in frequencies of related words over time and so on, you know, does an increase in this particular word or this particular trio look significant? You know, for example, like Google Books, we have a whole lot more data from the end of the 17th century than from the beginning of the 16th. And with Google Books too, there are shifts in the quantities of data over time. So that affects Google Ngrams and it affects us. But our statistical measures and our mutual information and the way we divide up data decade by decade is an attempt to address that. So those are, I don't know, relevant issues anyway. But I don't know Google Ngram statistics inside out, so I'd have to look more closely at that.
Okay, thank you. Another question. There was a slide on sermon trios.
Yeah.
One of the attendees has commented, the pair heaven-earth appears also as earth-heaven. Is this because you used one of these words as a search pivot each time? If so, pairings could appear differently.
Yeah. So in fact, this is because we've, good eye and well spotted, there was so yes, what can happen, of course, is that we have multiple permutations of trios and we have even more permutations of any given quad. We've experimented with this in a couple of different ways. We've experimented with trios and their different permutations and the statistical measures associated with them. And this becomes even more important with quads. The statistical measures, without going into too much detail, are based on an early presentation. In fact, the original presentation of mutual information statistics by Fano in the mid 20th century, who builds strength of co-occurrence statistics, not just for pairs of co-occurring events, in this case pairs of co-occurring words, but also further up into trios and so on. In computational linguistics, that hasn't become the norm. As I've said, the pairs are the norm, and people don't really build into trios and quads. But the statistics, was always there. The measure of strength of co-occurrence then is analyzed for each pair, so body and part, for example, and then each pair can build up into a huge number of trios. So you have then body, part, and any number of third words. The ultimate final strength of co-occurrence score then depends on that third word. So a trio ordered in different ways can have different scores. And one of the things that we've looked at is what the range of scores can be for each permutation and how different it can be. And it can actually be quite different. And there are sort of explainable reasons for that. And then sometimes it isn't so different. We've kind of got, again, two different ways of interacting with the data here, where we sometimes look at every single permutation, and we sometimes aggregate permutations and then come up with a statistical kind of summary. And I've actually drawn this data for these trios from the non-aggregated trios. So each permutation in the data that I drew this from is in fact listed differently. And so that's why that's happened. It's become an interesting thing as we've started processing this data as well for different end users and for different collaborators. because for any given end user or collaborator, all those different permutations might not be so interesting as they are to us as linguists. And so, for an average end user, aggregating them is necessary. But again, as a linguist, there are some times that we actually want to ask questions about different permutations.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware that we were going to be finishing after an hour, but we do have a lot more questions. Do you have a few more minutes, Seth, to answer these?
I'm happy to stick around and address a few more questions, definitely.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Can you say something more about the research questions and the goal of the BBC Radio News Scripts project?
Yeah, it's at a stage where we don't. It's not even research questions really at the moment. It's experiments with the data, and I can say, let's see where this came from though. So in 2018, kind of at the end of the initial funding round for the Linguistic DNA Project, the Digital Humanities Institute hosted what we called an impact workshop with participants from external organizations that included the Oxford English Dictionary, which is how we got started with the collaboration with the OED. It also included the BBC, the Wellcome Trust, some publishers, ProQuest as a publisher of lots of different text collections, to explore, well, to present them with what we had done with the Linguistic DNA Project and the types of things that you can do with trio and quad data, and then to also identify their needs and where our offer and their needs might intersect and how we might come up with new collaborative projects of some kind. So that was a one-day workshop. It was fantastic. It was really interesting. We learned, for example, that with a lot of these text collections, whether it's the BBC News Scripts or the Wellcome Trust's text collections, it's clear that most users access a very, very small portion of these extremely large collections, and that this very, very small number of texts is accessed over and over and over again. And for some reason, for some instances, that's because these are just really important texts, and so people refer to them a lot. But it does seem, as we talk more and more, like there should be possibilities for digging into these other texts. And so we started thinking, okay, well, how can we use these trios and quads to lead from, say, one text and its trio and quad data to a set of other texts that have similar trio and quad data, and maybe point people in directions that they might never have gone, maybe even help people identify connections between texts that they might never have seen, connections that aren't because they were written at the same time, or they're written by the same author, or they're even on the same topic ostensibly, but because there are somehow comparable discourses in terms of trio and quad data. So with the BBC News Scripts, they've been transcribing, a lot of these are scanned documents, it's similar in a way to EBO TCP. They're 20th century, so they're clearer and cleaner by default, but they're scanned documents, and the BBC has been transcribing them bit by bit, and then also working through data protection when names are mentioned and so on. But they're really just now becoming available, and they were interested in the possibilities of allowing their end users to interact with them in kind of more meaningful and richer ways, and to be able to explore the full depth of the collection. And so that's really what the experiment is can we help the end users eventually explore it in new ways.
Great, thank you. We have a question about the trios again. Having identified trios of content words, is it productive to further analyze for associated non-content words, if, but, however, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there was, again, with all of the experiments that we've done, there was an early experiment that really was because of data size. So in order to shrink the data, basically, in an early experiment, we only looked at nouns, and we looked at the possibility of building trios of nouns, and then for the fourth word, allowing any word class. And kind of talked about the theory of why we would do that, and then experimenting with it. Of course, the data, just explodes. My sense from looking at the data, and my sense as well from the from a kind of theoretical perspective, is that with small co-occurrence windows, that probably becomes really interesting. Because the idea that with a particular preposition and that it might change the meaning, I don't know, bring up versus bring down, as adjacent pairs, or even negation in adjacent pairs or in small phrases. You know, as soon as you add not, you know, so something is not divine versus something is divine, or not entirely divine, or whatever it might be. Those sorts of grammatical words, I think could probably be really interesting. With the larger windows, my sense from looking at data and my sense theoretically is that it's probably much harder to interpret, and the things that might come through as significant might actually, in kind of meaningful linguistic terms, not actually be all that interesting. I don't know if I have an example to the contrary on that. Well, actually, one of the things that comes through with the science texts with a previous experiment is something about epistemic modality. So in the primary data analysis that we usually use, we have included nouns, adjectives, and verbs, but not auxiliary and modal verbs. But we have run this with versions where we did use modal verbs. And one of the things that we saw in the science texts was that modality comes through a lot. So you get might and may and this sort of thing that expresses epistemic uncertainty. And it's clearly something about the science texts. And I suspect probably that changes over time too, although I can't say that that's definitely the case. So yes, there is that potential, but I think also there's just the potential to sort of add a bunch of noise that isn't necessarily interesting. Again, I think these things, if we have sort of world enough in time and enough data processing power and so on, then we can just keep running these experiments and keeps trying to find out.
Okay. Now this question was asked just at the beginning of the Q&A, and it kind of sounds as though, from what you've answered so far, this is the way it works, but the question is, are the trios based on intuitive observations?
Let's see. I'm going to have to think about how to answer the question. So the trios are not identified via anything that is intuitive. What the computer does, in fact, what a network of 40 computers working together for hours and hours and hours do is to go through all of EBO TCP word by word, and with each word count 50 tokens to the left and 50 tokens to the right, and identify every single pair. So with the first example of the word diversity, but again, doing this with every word, with the first word, identify every single pair and then build up from those pairs to every single trio. And again, that just builds exponential amounts of data for every single word. And then it goes to the next word in the sentence and it does the same thing. And then it aggregates this across all of EBO TCP and gives us these lists of trios, and we conduct the statistical calculations to identify those, well, to be able to rank and sort and filter the trios that are the most common and the ones that have kind of the strongest sort of internal cohesiveness, and then the ones that sort of have an unusualness. So nothing about that is, I'm measuring my words here a little bit. Effectively, nothing about that is intuitive. I mean, if we get into the philosophy and the statistics and so on, you know, the reason that we choose one statistical measure over another, and you know, there are theoretical foundations for this, and the amount that intuition might come in, there's a philosophical question that it's deeper, but I think I can effectively say that none of that is intuitive. When it comes to analyzing the trios in the texts, what we try to do, well, what we do is scholarly linguistic analysis, where we look at established methods of semantic analysis, where we look at, for example, semantic relations and synonymy and hyponymy and co-hyponymy and antonymy, and the sorts of semantic relations that hold between the words in the trios if they do hold, and we look at pragmatic processes of specifying meaning and narrowing meaning and so on, defeasing meaning. We look at pragmatic processes, in some cases looking broader context in terms of the writer's intention and reader's interpretation and so on. And so the degree to which intuition plays a role in those things, in those processes, those analyses are, again, systematic and established, and we can describe them in kind of technical detail. And still, these are all analyses of linguistic meaning, which require a human interpreter, and it's a hermeneutic process, and ultimately there have to be subjective elements. But as with any linguistic analysis, I think we systematically avoid intuition as much as possible.
Great, thank you very much for confirming that. We do have a couple of questions left, but I think we better wrap up there, and then for anyone who's asked a question that we haven't answered, we'll pass these on to Seth and contact you as soon as we have something to share. Thank you very much, Seth, and thank you everyone for attending today.
Thank you. Thanks very much.